Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening or this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are, for a discussion of immigration systems in transition. I'm Teresa Cardinal-Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and we are happy you have joined us today for this discussion. For those not familiar with us, the Bipartisan Policy Center is a Washington, D.C.-based think tank that actively fosters bipartisanship by combining the best ideas from both parties to promote health, security, and opportunity for all Americans. As part of our work on immigration reform, we have been looking at ways that the United States might rethink our legal immigration system, and in particular, what lessons we might learn from other countries. In March of this year, we released a report and held an event called Works in Progress that examined how other countries and the United States think about temporary and permanent work visas and how migrants transition from one to the other. In May, we published a report and held another event that looked at immigration from the state level and various proposals that have been introduced by states for state-based visa programs. And now we have a report that examines how Canada and Australia, as well as some other countries, have evolved their immigration systems to points-based systems they have today, systems that many, including President Trump, have looked at with favor. For this report, we conducted interviews with experts in immigration policy, politics, and opinion polling from countries in question to understand the history, circumstances, and particulars of how Canada and Australia, as well as Japan and New Zealand, evolved their systems. As we will see and hear today, the transition to so-called merit-based point systems was not always smooth, but was facilitated by factors that may or may not be replicable in the United States. So we look forward to hearing more about this report from its author, Chris Ramon, and from our distinguished panel of experts this evening, who I will introduce now. Cristobal Ramon is Senior Policy Analyst with BPC's Immigration Project and an expert in comparative migration studies. Before joining BPC, he served as a research consultant on immigration integration issues at the National Immigration Forum. As a graduate student, he interned with the Migration Policy Institute, the German Marshall Fund's migration program, and the U.S. Helsinki Commission. And he completed a Fulbright scholarship in Spain, researching the evolution of their migration systems. Chris will present the major findings of the report, and then we will be moderating a panel, including two of the experts who were interviewed for the report, as well as BPC's fellow Ruth Fossum. The experts include Daniel Hebert is Professor of Geography at the University of British Columbia. He has led large projects on immigration and cultural diversity in Canada on the relationship between cultural diversity, human rights, and national security. Professor Hebert also has participated in a variety of advisory positions in the Canadian government, including the Deputy Minister's Advisory Council of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, and the Research Advisory Committee of the IRCC. Dr. Nana Oishi is Associate Professor in Japanese Studies at the University of Melbourne, Australia. Prior to her current position, she was Professor of Sociology at Sophia University in Tokyo and Policy Analyst at the International Labour Organization in Geneva. She has served the United Nations Expert Meeting on Migration, Development, and Social Protection, and various national advisory boards on immigration in Japan. And lastly, Ruth Ellen Wassum is a fellow with BPC's Immigration Project. She's currently a professor of policy practice at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin, where she teaches courses on immigration policy and legislative development. And for more than 25 years, Ruth was an immigration policy specialist at the U.S. Library of Congress's Congressional Research Service. And we look forward to hearing all of them discuss our issues today. One last thing before we get started. Following the panel discussion, we'll have a Q&A session. So if you have a question you'd like to ask our panelists, you can do so by entering your question in the live chat on YouTube or in the comment section on Facebook. Just start your question with a Q so we can identify it easily. You can also tweet at us using the hashtag BPCLive. You can post these questions anytime during the panel, and we'll get to them at the end. Thank you again for joining us, and now I'd like to turn things over to Chris Ramon to discuss the report.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you everybody for tuning in today. We definitely appreciate the support. As Teresa said, today is the launch of our newest report that examines how the immigration systems in Canada and Australia have evolved over time and the lessons that we can learn from them. And the name of this report is Immigration Systems in Transition, Lessons for U.S. Immigration Reform from Australia and Canada. Next slide. So Teresa kind of helped set up the discussion a little bit by kind of giving a little bit of the rationale why we produced the study. But we wanted to dive in a little bit more into the explanation. What we've seen in the US debate around discussions of implementing a points-based system. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the points-based system, it's a system in which governments, for instance, the one in Australia and the one in Canada, allocate points based on an individual's professional academic qualifications and their personal characteristics. Individuals who pass a certain threshold then are able to live and work in these countries on a permanent basis. Whenever we're seeing this debate happen here in the United States, we always think a lot about the selection of the immigrants. How many points should we give to a certain qualification? What skills should we prioritize? How many immigrants should we bring in? But the thing is that these immigration systems and the selection of migrants exist in very dynamic systems that can change over time. And so we decided to look at their history to get a sense of why these governments have been able to successfully implement and revise them over time, to get a better sense of what we can learn here in the United States if we're going to implement similar systems. Our review of the history of these systems came up with three themes that were very important in these two countries. One is that these governments secured public support for skilled migration. Second, their governments have the capacity to rapidly change their immigration systems, oftentimes without legislation. And the other thing is that these governments gather data on the outcomes of these systems to assess them and revise them based on policy goals. Next slide. So the first theme is developing the narrative to secure public support for immigration. Now, both governments created messaging at different points in their histories to be able to get their publics on board with expanding immigration, particularly skilled immigration. In the case of Canada, Canada did not seek public support when it implemented its points-based system in 1967. But in the 1980s, the Canadian government recognized that their labor force was going to shrink considerably due to declining birth rates. And they realized that the way they could offset this is by expanding immigration significantly. So the Canadian government during this period in the 80s came up with a very simple but effective message. Canada benefits economically from well-managed immigration. And this message was actually successful. We'll dig into a little bit more into this in the panel, but one of the reasons it was successful is that political elites and media outlets bought into the message, and the Canadian public also bought into the message as well, partly because the message was simple, but partly because the message sort of aligned with Canadian support for immigration. And Professor Hebert will explore this a little bit more in the panel. But the basic point is that Canada's public and political elites bought into this and made this message successful, and Canada expanded skilled migration to be able to meet its policy goal. Next slide. Now, Australia, the picture is a little bit more complex. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Conservative Prime Minister John Howard adopted a tough but fair immigration message that prioritized skilled immigration. Now, the context for this is in the late 1980s and the early 1990s is that some parts of the Australian public felt that the immigration system wasn't working for the country and it wasn't working economically. Some felt that there was just too much family-based immigration, or that the country wasn't dealing enough with the arrivals of asylum seekers who were arriving by boats. And so Prime Minister Howard's message was basically saying, we're going to dictate the conditions in which immigrants come here. And he expanded skilled migration while cutting back on family-based immigration and humanitarian-based immigration. And the message did have some success. I mean, when we spoke with experts, they did say that it helped foster more confidence in the immigration system. And partly it's because, Australians do see immigrants as contributing to the economy. But the thing is that this message only had a limited impact because there were other factors just that impacted how Australians view immigration. So, for instance, the condition of the labor market impacts their views about immigrants. And as I noted earlier, issues around, say, for instance, the arrival of asylum seekers via boats is another issue that shaped how they view immigrants. So the message had some success, but certainly other factors shaped how Australians view immigration. And that's kind of the important takeaway from the country there. Next slide. Now, using executive authority to implement and revise the immigration system, this is also something that's really important. Both governments have used two major vehicles to change their immigration systems. First, both of them use parliamentary systems to be able to quickly change immigration legislation. For those of you who are not familiar with what a parliamentary system is, in particular a Westminster parliamentary system, it is one in which the parliament, so legislature, is the foundational government body. And from the parliament, the party that has a majority is able to form a cabinet with the prime minister, who is the head of government, and the cabinet around them. And that is the executive. So the executive is one and the same with the parliament. And this is a little bit different than the system we have here in the United States, where you have the executive branch and you have the legislative branch. And oftentimes they can come into conflict, especially if they're controlled by two different parties. But in a parliamentary system, that doesn't necessarily exist. In fact, if you have a majority in the parliament, a prime minister can make a recommendation for a vote, and all members of the majority must vote in line with the prime minister's recommendation. And that means legislation can move a lot more quickly. But what's also important to understand that in Canada and Australia, there are instruments and legal authorities that also allow the executive in these countries to dramatically change the immigration system. One thing, for instance, is that in Australia, the Australian Migration Act of 1958 gives the executive significant authority to change the selection criteria for immigrants. And that is a significant power that the Australian executive has. And Professor Hebert will explore this a little bit more in Canada, where Canada uses an instrument called Orders in Council to be able to implement and make dramatic changes to its system as well. And so the key point here is that these countries have the ability to change their immigration systems with legislation, but can also make dramatic changes without legislation. And that's the most important thing. Next slide. The last theme is gathering data to assess the immigration system. So both Canada and Australia, at different points, began gathering some pretty comprehensive data about the immigrants that are coming through the points-based systems. In Canada in the 1980s, the country created the Longitudinal Immigration Database to track the outcomes of immigrants that are coming through the points-based system. And this is a really robust tool. It tracks a whole host of different factors, not only in immigrants' landing records, but census document tax information, to be able to see how an immigrant is faring over time. And the Canadian government has used this to assess and revise its points-based system in response to what's found. And the Australian government followed suit in 2009 with the continuous survey of Australia's migrants for similar purposes. And so this is really important because you're able to gather data that gives you a sense of how the system is working. And as I noted earlier, if you have a system where you can make dramatic or small changes to the immigration system, oftentimes without legislation, you can adjust to these changes and conditions. So that's how you can kind of see how the data works. The data allows you to be able to assess, are we meeting messaging goals? Are we meeting economic goals? Are we meeting policy goals? Well, then, if not, let's make changes to make that happen. And so that's how the three factors work together. Next slide. So in short, Australia and Canada have institutions data and have made political decisions that allow their governments to be able to successfully implement and revise these systems over time. And so in the United States, the question is, well, how do you create a similar system? And it doesn't necessarily have to be a points-based system, but certainly a system that is very responsive and dynamic and responds to different changing conditions, I think is going to be essential for creating a more robust system in the United States. The issue, of course, is that we need to accommodate our own institutions, our political culture, and our immigration heritage. As I noted earlier, we have a presidential system in which you have the executive and legislative branches that oftentimes can come into conflict with each other, especially on immigration issues. And that's something that we need to address. But I think the other challenge, of course, is dealing with a very divisive subject that can create a lot of polarization, and how you can come together as a country to be able to come up with a dynamic system that navigates this division that exists on immigration is going to be a challenge that I think all legislators, all policymakers, and immigration stakeholders need to deal with if they're going to create a dynamic system. So with that, I will now turn to the panel discussion with our panelists. So before I start, once again, a nice little reminder to everybody, questions, you can submit your questions on the comments in YouTube or Facebook. And of course, you can always tag us on Twitter at #BPCLive. We'll be continuing to gather your questions throughout this discussion. So we're going to actually break this discussion into the three themes that I explored in my presentation. And so with theme one is developing the narrative to secure public support. Dan, I spoke a little bit to this in my presentation, but let's dive into what factors allowed the Canadian government to get public support for expanding immigration in the 1980s and the 1990s.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. And I just want to take a quick note to say thanks for inviting me to your panel discussion. I have to say that, like many Canadians, I'm absolutely fascinated by what's going on south of the border, especially just now. So it's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, first to underline your point, immigration in Canada basically doubled over the decade of the 1980s. And a second kind of thing to mention is that this happened at a time when the public wasn't really expecting it to happen, nor was enthusiastic about it happening. There was quite a degree of skepticism in the general public. So how was the government then able to expand immigration at a time when it wasn't really expected? Well, the first thing was developing a new narrative. When I say new narrative, maybe I should just qualify that by saying that it built on components of earlier narratives that resonated with the Canadian public. And I would say that new narrative really had three key kind of features. And one of them was, we've got a new demographic challenge. We've seen a much reduced birth rate in the Canadian population. If we just do nothing, we're going to end up with aging of our population, and eventually we're going to start seeing pressure on taxation, the capacity of taxation to fund social programs. So that was a kind of a new element of the narrative. But then there were two older elements that came in. One of them was that the Canadian government is really adept at selecting immigrants who are going to make a positive economic impact on Canada. And, you know, to put it in kind of simplistic terms, I would say that had a positive kind of impact on bringing the right center side of the political spectrum on board. You know, we'll get this right. It's going to be good for the Canadian economy. Then the third component of the narrative was to say that this will ensure that Canada is an open and diverse society. And that helped, I think, bring the center-left side of the political spectrum on board. So by building a narrative that kind of spoke to the past of Canada, that spoke about immigration as a frequently used solution for national problems, national challenges, and that it would be both economically beneficial and have this ability to shape the nature of diversity in Canada, all of those things kind of resonated. And basically, as you said, I think you used the term that I used, which is it helped build an elite consensus between the political system, the media, and the corporate system of Canada. That helped a lot too.
Fantastic. Nana, we'll pivot to you, thinking about Australia. In addition to messaging from prime ministers like John Howard and other politicians, what other factors shape support for immigration in Australia?
Yes, thank you, Chris. And I would also like to thank you and the organizers for your kind invitation extended to me. Yes, to respond to your question, I think you already mentioned in your presentation about the impacts of asylum seekers and refugees and an economic factor. And I would say that the economic factor really did play the major role, probably the most important role in Australia for many years, just as in many other countries. Australia has been experiencing an economic growth for the last 30 years or so, until this year when we were hit by COVID-19. So it was relatively easy for people to support immigration. And its long history of immigration also counted a lot too. But I have to say that the support for immigration has been gradually declining and decreasing for the last 5 years or so because of overpopulation, housing shortage, and a surge in property prices. According to a survey last year, the majority of Australians expressed their concerns about the impact of immigration on the overcrowding of their cities. But because of this, the government took several actions. One was to accelerate its shift from permanent immigration to temporary migration. And now there are a lot more skilled migrants on temporary visa. It is much harder for them to stay in Australia permanently. The government also started issuing more visas for migrants who settle in non-metropolitan areas or rural areas. And now the Minister of Immigration, Mr. Alan Tudge, is also holding the position of Minister for Population and Urban Structure at the same time. So the immigration issues are tackled not just for economic or immigration issue itself, but it's dealt with from the perspective of population and urban structure. So in other words, the government is really sending out a message to the public that yes, we are listening to you, we are addressing your concerns in our policies. So I think this kind of quick political response by the government is also contributing to the public overall support for immigration in Australia. But I have to say the situation is likely to change after COVID, and I can perhaps talk about it later during the Q&A session.
Great. And we'll stay with you. The report that we wrote didn't just simply look at Australia and Canada. We also looked at Japan and New Zealand. And the pull-out box in the report talked about how Japan has been expanding immigration recently. Why is it that Japan has been expanding migration so rapidly in recent years? What are sort of the underlying factors of this?
Yes, I'm actually quite thankful that you guys addressed this issue of the expansion of migration in Japan, because I would actually say that this is a migration big bang in Japan, where the government decided to accept 345,000 migrants over the next 5 years in a wide range of sectors such as agriculture, construction, and elderly care, which used to be called or perceived as unskilled or semi-skilled sectors. And in my view, this is the biggest policy change in Japan's immigration policy. So immigration history. So the question is, how did it happen? And I would say that there are three interrelated factors behind it. The first one is a demographic one. Japan's population has started to decline in 2005, which alarmed a lot of policymakers because it cast a shadow over the country's long-term economic growth. This led to the second factor, which is labor shortage. Japan's labor force is projected to decline by 40% between 2015 and 2040. And Japan is now ranked a #1 skill shortage country in the industrialized world. So many companies are desperately looking for workers, including migrants from other countries. And the situation has been particularly grave in the rural areas. And the third factor, which is related to the second one, was the national election in 2019. To win this election, our former Prime Minister, Mr. Abe, and his advisors needed to secure votes in non-metropolitan areas. And they expected that pushing this new immigration policies will bring in migrants in a wide range of sectors could probably help win their votes. So it was part of the election strategy, which worked out pretty well in the end. So there's three factors that played the role.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the key thing that we were looking at, why this development is so important for the report, is that sort of those underlying factors parallel a little bit what we saw with Canada, for instance, in the 1980s. So Ruth, taking the view from the United States, we've been talking about narratives. How can lawmakers and immigration stakeholders sort of develop a mission statement for a new immigration system that articulates its goals and objectives for the public, kind of given what we've just talked about with Canada and Japan and Australia?
Well, there's a couple ways that we can do this going forward. And I think that, and I want to thank you, by the way, Chris, for writing an excellent report. And it's work like this that helps. It tees up this discussion. And a mission statement, I think if it's too top down, will not be as effective. And we know from polling that BPC has done and many other polls out there that the American public supports immigration. Some even support increasing immigration. And we know that the American public thinks our current system doesn't work. So this is an optimal time from that perspective. I would recommend, whether they're town halls, field hearings for Congress, or if there's another special commission that's set up, but getting into the field, getting into the communities to go beyond just what we do in Washington to raise these issues. Even if the mission, what we learn from these types of exchanges, it's important to meet the public where they are, because what we're proposing in a report like this would be a dramatic departure for the United States. And I think it's important to be across the country in discussing these ideas, and then refine the mission statement based on those. But let the public speak about these things, because it's going to be an important and much needed change in our policies.
Right. One follow-up question before we go to the next theme is, Nana, with Japan, you and I talked about this in the interview for this report, and it came up in the report. These narratives weren't top-down in some ways. These narratives around the reasons for expanding immigration came from the bottom up, or from different, it didn't come straight from the government, is what I'm trying to say. So there was sort of that little bottom-up, grassroots kind of energy that pushed a little bit for the expansion of immigration. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I would say that, as I mentioned earlier, the labor shortages in the rural areas were quite grave. So there are a lot of governors of regional areas, and a lot of business sectors and executives. A lot of them were lobbying to the government that they actually really badly needed workers from overseas. And a lot of lobbyings, and also a lot of people began to realize the importance of migration. And when you look at the poll, it's quite clear that a lot more Japanese are supporting immigration, a lot more so than before. So this is a huge change. So it was actually good timing that the government introduced this policy, because the public is a lot more aware that their economy cannot survive without immigration. It's a huge change, I would say.
Yeah. And Dan, in our conversation, and this comes up in the report, you talked about how important the immigrant integration sector is for getting that public buy-in at the grassroots level. Could you speak to that for a minute?
Sure, but could I just first comment to say that the same thing that Nana was just speaking about in terms of Japan now happened in Canada just a little bit earlier, right? So we had that same kind of widespread realization. And if I could just give your viewers a statistic that I think is so helpful to understand the demographic change that occurred in Canada. For nearly all of Canadian history, until 1981, there were always twice as many young people as there were people who were about to leave the labor market. I mean, if you want a little bit of a quick definition, it's the ratio of people who are between 15 and 25 compared to those who are between 55 and 65. For all of Canadian history until 1981, there was twice as many. Now there's not even as many as people who are young compared to people who are about to leave the labor market. And that realization began to really set in the 1980s, and it facilitated all of this. But Chris, you asked, and that also brought the business side of Canada very much into the frame of supporting larger immigration numbers. But you also asked about the way that Canada has designed its integration system and how that also has these kinds of effects. And, really quickly, what happens in Canada is the national government takes responsibility for immigrant integration. And in taking that responsibility, what it does is it sets up quite a large fund of money, which it distributes to nonprofit agencies and educational institutions, so that all immigrants that come to Canada have, first of all, free access to language training in either English or French, depending on the part of the country they are, and also free access to orientation programs to facilitate their integration. How do banks work? How do you get a job? What is the bus system? All of that kind of stuff. And this employs a lot of people It brings a lot of people into the sort of frame of being stakeholders in the immigration system. And it also has quite a large impact in terms of newcomers' capacities to understand Canadian society and to make adjustments to become part of that society.
Yeah, and like I said, it was always interesting seeing how you create jobs, you get buy-in. I mean, that's kind of the bottom line, which is I love that line from the report. So we're going to now shift to theme 2 about executive authority to implement and revise the immigration system. Dan, like I said, I queued this up a little bit for you. Orders in council, big important part of Canadian immigration policy history.
Yeah. Really quickly, the way things work in Canada is the Prime Minister appoints a cabinet minister. And in our case, the one we're interested in is the Minister of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship. And when the Prime Minister makes that appointment, the incoming minister is given a mandate letter, and it sets out the priorities of the Prime Minister for that ministry. So usually like 15, 20 things are listed, point bullet list and everything else. Once the minister has those, if you like, marching orders, they have a huge amount of flexibility in how they execute those goals, how they try to achieve those goals. And what they're entitled to do is to give them the ministry that they serve orders in council or ministerial instructions. And those can change quite dramatically the way that the system works. They can really fundamentally readjust, but always within the framework of getting us to achieve those goals. And one other thing that I think is so integral and important in the Canadian system is those orders in council just happen behind the scenes. They're not like there's not like a press conference or a big fanfare when there's an order in council kind of a change. Therefore, you can have a fundamental reordering of things. So let me just give you one example. What's the extent to which you want to give employers a voice in selecting immigrants versus how much do you want to select immigrants based on their skill levels, their educational achievements, and so forth? That's a pretty important kind of question if you want to make immigration have a positive economic impact. And with orders in council, you can just shift from one of those priorities to the other as you feel it's necessary to do without having to stage parliamentary debates, without having to stage press conferences and so on. And for the most part, this enables a highly adaptive and flexible system. But there is one cost to the Canadian means to achieve this, and that is the public can easily become disengaged in the sense that they're not hearing the debates. They're not in front of them. It's suddenly we move from one orientation to another orientation. And by the way, we didn't even bother to tell you because we can just do this. And frequently then you find a public who is not as knowledgeable as one might like it to be on issues of immigration. And therefore, sometimes there's kind of a jarring impact, right? So the public finds out about something they didn't know about in terms of policy, and that can lead to some political blowback in those kinds of circumstances.
Right. Sticking on that subject a little bit, what are sort of the historical examples where orders in council were used to change the Canadian immigration system? I'm thinking 1967 and 2015 were pivotal years.
Yeah, absolutely pivotal. That's precisely the right word. So Canada decided to tear up its list of preferred countries for immigration in 1962. So until 1962, like many of similar kinds of countries, including the United States, Canada had a racial preference in its immigration system, and it found that increasingly embarrassing. In the decade of the 1960s, the era of civil rights, the era of the rise of developing countries in their importance in the United Nations and so forth. So it tore up that list, but it didn't really have anything to replace it with. And it took a few years of policy churn to figure out how to do this. And all of that was conducted behind the scenes. And the inauguration of our points system in 1967, for lack of a better word, we invented the idea of a point system in 1967. All of that came about without a really close parliamentary debate. It was just a new system that was then conceived and executed. And the idea was, of course, let's see if this works. And if it does, great. If it doesn't, we'll move on and try something else. And all of that could happen in the Canadian system through orders in council rather than the very public nature that immigration policy takes in many other countries. And very quickly, I'll just say we had a similar kind of very big change in priority, in the philosophy of the system, and the very fabric of the system in 2015, when we borrowed very heavily from New Zealand and to some degree Australia, and put in place something that we call express entry, which is a very different way of mechanizing our desire to get economically productive immigration than we had in the past. And again, that was done through just an exercise between the Minister of our Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada department and the staff in that department, just thinking through what's the most logical way to do this, and then coming up with that new mechanism.
Yeah. I'm going to bring in Ruth into this. Like I talked about in the presentation, obviously the institutional control over immigration in the United States there's always been that conflict between the executive branch and Congress, right? How could the United States create a dynamic immigration system that sort of balances these two competing institutional forces in our country?
And I think that's an excellent point, because we don't have parliamentary forms of government. And there has been the interpretation of the Constitution that the U.S. Congress has plenary power over immigration. And that's different, but it doesn't mean it makes this impossible. And if we go back and think of the mission statement we developed with your first set of questions, and if it weaves together the traditions that are already in immigration law of employment-based, family-based, humanitarian, if those foundational concepts in diversity of origin, one of the newer concepts, the idea would be shifting the day-to-day operations of that to the executive branch. And as you point out in your report, that would not be easy because of the backlash to the executive orders that have occurred in this century. As a result, I would argue that Congress not being able to act on immigration. But that makes the case that setting up a mechanism, whether it's rested solely in the executive branch, whether it's some type of commission that exists between Congress and the president with people appointed by both branches of government, there are different ways that you could accomplish this and professionalize and standardize the immigration process, so it's less politicized. So this would be, the political strategy probably should be coupled somewhat with the mission and the messaging, and thinking about what do you want to have at the end of the day to achieve the mission that you set out, and then where would that reside? So these are difficult questions, but they're not insurmountable. And I think, again, timing, what do they say? Timing is everything. The frustration with immigration, the difficulty in doing immigration legislation is a pretty compelling argument to have something that does more of these day-to-day, both fact-finding and data building, and also decision makings and setting priorities. I would imagine Congress would still want to set the overall priorities, but how you fine-tune that from year to year, shifting that responsibility to the executive branch or an independent commission, is an idea that's time has come.
Right. looking at your time and working on this subject here in the US, how do you see sort of this fact that executive actions really have come to become a pretty potent tool for immigration policy formation in the United States, especially under this administration and a little bit with the last administration? Is this a divergence from past practices where we relied on legislation as the primary form to develop our immigration policy?
Well, it's interesting. I would argue that executive actions have always occurred when there was a gap legislatively. So I love the example to use of President Dwight Eisenhower, who paroled in Hungarian refugees during the revolution because there was not a pathway. There was not a Refugee Act back in 1957-58 when this was happening. So he used executive authority to do that. And let me tell you, the historical record showed Congress hit the ceiling. They ultimately passed legislation to adjust the Hungarians, but time and time again, executive actions occurred when it looked when there wasn't a pathway and Congress wasn't acting. And I could give you many more examples than time allows. It's just that we've reached a point politically where it's extremely difficult to enact immigration legislation, even when there were several times in this century where we had strong bipartisan support to do immigration legislation. So that really begs the question of how much of these decisions should be made legislatively and how many of them can be assigned to an administrative body or commission to make these decisions, and what decisions would be made by them. So I don't think that Congress would give up having a lot of specificity over how this would be done, but a lot of these things could be handled that way. And again, commissions in immigration are a long-standing tradition. It's just they've only had the ability to recommend changes in the law, not to actually implement changes in the law. So that's the key point that's different from the past.
Dan, Nana, any follow-up comments on what Ruth said, your perspectives?
I think I'm the last person you want to have comment on the U.S. situation. I'm just not an expert in that, but I think the idea of having some kind of consensus that somehow reaches into bipartisan space and having mechanisms to implement changes that don't have the kind of hyper-politicized environment would be beneficial. That's a Canadian viewpoint, and of course you're in charge of your country. You can figure it out, but that would be my sort of advice from afar.
Not too far though. We're neighbors, right? So
yeah.
So let's keep on with this. We're going to go to the last theme, and then as we can go from there. Gathering data to assess the immigration system. Nana, actually, we'll start with you. Now, you've looked at the development of Japan's points-based system. How has Japan assessed it over time? What have you found?
I would say that the overall assessment has been quite positive, and the government has been gathering the data on a regular basis, and according to the recent survey, the number of the applicants has been increasing every year, and so far 24,000 skilled workers have been registered under the scheme. And the system has also gone through quite a few revisions for the last 8 years or so, and now if you're it's kind of incredible now, but if you are qualified under this system, and then you can get permanent residency quite quickly. I mean, if you're a regular skilled worker, you can get permanent residency after 5 years. But if you score 80 points, you can do so only after 1 year. In 1 year, it's quite fast for permanent residency, even compared with other industrialized countries. And it's a big positive development. And Also, the retention rate, it's quite good. And according to the most recent survey, 84% of the people who got qualified under this points-based system are still working in Japan. This figure is quite high because the skilled migrants have been quite known for their very high turnover rates. And a lot of companies were complaining about it before. But this really shows that as long as you offer good incentives, such as spouse visa, parental visa. In Japan, for example, if you have small kids, then if you're qualified under the scheme, then you can bring your parents to the country to stay and live with you, which is quite rare as well compared with many other industrialized countries. So you can also bring domestic worker, etc. There are a lot of incentives under this system. So as long as you offer incentives to skilled workers, skilled migrants, they will stay. So I would say that they has been quite, the assessment is positive, but at the same time, there are still remaining challenges such as limited availability of multilingual medical services and social services. Educational support for children is still not perfect. Housing discrimination, etc. And there are some challenges that are still remaining. But since the Japanese government launched this new immigration policies 2 years ago, it has also established a new administrative body called Immigration Services Agency to address these issues of social integration. So I would say the situation is likely to improve over the next decade or so. So I'm still keeping my fingers crossed, and I'm still quite positive about the country's future.
Yeah. And then one quick thing to follow up on that, for people who are not familiar with the Japanese points-based system, we talked about this in our interview. It's not a selection mechanism, it's a retention mechanism. What's the difference from the one that we see in Canada, for instance?
Yeah, thank you for addressing the point. Yeah, it's kind of different. In fact, some people can still come in under this system from overseas, but 92% of people who are qualified under this system are actually already in Japan. So basically they're applying for this point system to get the benefits, to be able to stay in the country as permanent immigrants, and also get various incentives, privileges that other skilled migrants don't get. So only 7% of them, 7 or 8% of them were selected overseas and coming directly to Japan. So it's really serving as a retention program rather than screening program. So.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the key thing whenever you hear that. There are different ways of approaching points-based systems, and Japan's is obviously very unique in that regard. Dan, let's go to the IMDb and how it was created and how Canada has used it over the years.
Yeah, it's such an important tool in the Canadian system. And just stop me if I go on too long, because it's something I work with all the time, so I'm kind of close to it. But someone had the bright idea in the bureaucracy, actually, back about 30 years ago, to bring together two things, which was all the information that gets collected when an immigrant officially lands in Canada. So, where they come from, their age, their sex, their level of education, their proficiency in language, the field of education, all that stuff is in a file, and that then gets married to all of their subsequent tax returns. I can't help laughing thinking about the issues that you have in the United States on who gets to divulge their tax returns and who doesn't. But let me just get back to the point. So all of their subsequent tax returns then are married with their data on arrival in Canada. So if someone arrives in 2007, let's say, we've got 12 or 13 years of information on, did they get a job? How much are they paid? Does the job coincide with the kind of education they had? What's the ratio of their employment earnings compared to, say, their earnings from other things like self-employment? Very important to nail down issues of entrepreneurialism, because that's a very important factor that many immigrants involve themselves in. Also, we know which people had to receive social assistance and all of that. And so we can calibrate the selection mechanisms with these economic outcomes. And then subsequently, we've also brought in the Canadian case, the census is linked to this. And that gives us tons of information about family formation and so on. We've also linked it to the General Social Survey, which tells us about people's personal networks and their voluntary activities and so forth. And finally, so far, we've also linked it to something called the iCare database, which is their utilization of immigrant settlement services. So we'll know, for example, if two people enter Canada from, say, India, maybe they both have a good university education. One of them comes to Canada and gets a bunch of settlement services. The other one just jumps into the labor market directly. We'll know which one receives better outcomes and to what extent. So we'll know the economic impact, say, of settlement services. And finally, on the horizon, what's going to be brought into this system is healthcare utilization. So we'll get a sense of that too. And to just end with a couple of quick examples. So why is this helpful? What do we get out of this? Well, one really clear indication is we learned over time through this database that one of the selection criteria in our grid has been experience in work outside of Canada. And it was thought that this would be a good indication if a person has, say, 5 years of experience in a field as opposed to 1 year of experience in a field. That was thought to be an indication that they would maybe be more successful in Canada. And what it turns out that it isn't. It turns out after tons of looking, lots of data, we can say definitively that Canadian employers simply don't care. A person comes in with 1 day of experience, 1 year of experience, 10 years of experience outside Canada. It's not important. They want to know, what can you do for me today? And they only care about Canadian experience. Well, that has a big impact on selection systems. Why would you prioritize international experience if Canadian employers don't care? At the same time, you then need to put much more priority on Canadian experience, which is why through this feedback, we've moved to what Nyla was just speaking about in terms of Japan. Get people in first on a work visa, see how well they do, and then upgrade them from a temporary visa to a permanent visa because Canadian experience matters, international experience doesn't. That's pretty profound when you think about it. That's like a pretty profound reorientation of a big selection system. And one final quicker example, we've learned that only less than half, about 40% of newcomers actually take up the offer of settlement services, free language training, orientation, et cetera, et cetera. So now we're learning, this is a new kind of information that's just been added over the last couple of years. Now we're learning to think more about how to target those services better. If they're not going to be used by everybody, well, let's make sure that the people who use them get something really valuable out of that experience. So now we're engaged in a national conversation about how to better utilize the kinds of settlement services. And all of this is brought because of real-time, good, very comprehensive data feedback.
Yeah, one quick question from the audience that I think relates to this, and the report covers this. The Privacy Commission in Canada for the creation.
Yeah.
By the way, IMDb is not the Internet Movie Database. It is the IMDb is the Longitudinal Immigration Database of Canada.
Yeah.
So just to clarify that.
Yeah.
You can't find your favorite actor and all the movies that they work with us, but the Privacy Commission, though, that was an obstacle to the creation of the database, correct?
Yeah, and maybe people are going to find this quite extraordinary. What happens in the Canadian context is this amazing comprehensive database is not just used in government, but it is actually released to the public in a very careful way. So we have a network across Canada of what we call research data centers. They're typically housed in Canadian universities. Anyone can apply to work in the research data center. They have to show, first of all, that they're capable. Secondly, they have to show that they have a good need for that particular information. And thirdly, they have to go through a security check to make sure that they aren't going to be doing anything stupid with all of this information. And so it's widely available. All of that required a heavy buy-in by the Privacy Commissioner because of the nature of the data. Now, personal stuff is stripped out, but nevertheless, it's a very rich source of information. So it really did have vigorous debate, let's say, on the privacy level. But here one has to ask this really basic question: what's the balance between absolute personal right to privacy on the one hand versus the public's right to know and the ability to shape policy in rational ways by having this kind of information? And in Canada, we kind of have gradually focused more of our attention on the public right to know. So the Privacy Commissioner kind of ticked the relevant box and allowed this very extensive database to be built.
Yeah. Ruth, last question, I think, then we'll start pivoting over to the questions from the audience. Obviously, you worked for Congressional Research Service, so you've worked for government, you're familiar with the databases that we have here. How close are we to actually developing something like the database that Canada has? What capacities do we have, and where are the gaps that we need to fill?
Well, we have a lot of this data, but it's in a variety of different places. It's fragmented. We collect for immigrants coming into the country a lot of information about them when at their point of arrival, their characteristics at the point of arrival, or when they're adjusting to legal permanent resident status. So it's a pretty good start on demographic data. We even funded for several cycles a longitudinal study of immigrants in the early 21st century. So about 15, 20 years ago, we did a sample of that. We clearly have income databases from the Internal Revenue Service. Social Security maintains databases. There is a whole host of government collected data, as well as experience doing sample surveys of the populations that we're talking about. So the hurdles are really someone who links these data sets together and then dealing with just what Dan was talking about, the privacy protections, whether or not statutory changes might need to be made to the Internal Revenue Code or to the Social Security Act about the use of this data. Because bear in mind, many people who are immigrants have connections in the United States, whether they're already married to a U.S. citizen or they ultimately are married to a U.S. citizen. So those linkage of households, the citizenship rights, and the view that we think that we'd like immigrants to become citizens. So bearing these issues in mind, while we have statutory authorities to collect more information on people who aren't citizens under the law, I consider that a time-bound thing. So I think doing it's definitely doable. The information's there. We're experienced, but it will be no small feat to bring the data together. There is already statutory authority to do this. It was passed in 1996 in immigration law that was passed in the early 2000s after 9/11 to have more interoperable databases. Even though some of these things were required from a law enforcement perspective, they've already created the authorities to do it for things that are much more instructive to the well-being of immigrants and for shaping future policies. So we can definitely do it, but it will take there'll be some startup costs.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to go now to audience questions. So a reminder, if you want to ask questions, you can ask questions on the comments in YouTube or Facebook, or you can tag us, do a hashtag BPC Live on Twitter. If you have any questions, we're going to stick on this a little bit with the database. Ruth, we'll start with you. What are, if you created this database, what are some of the issues related around immigration enforcement and using this database for immigration enforcement?
Well, I think that's clearly one of the statutory things that would have to be dealt with is drawing a clear line on whether or not it could be made available to law enforcement. Who has access to this data? And this comes up repeatedly. And this is, it would be a subject of great debate. but particularly when we have a pattern of mixed status households already. And I don't expect that to change just if we reform immigration law. These practices exist and family formation. So I think that whether it's employment data, whether it's collected by the Department of Labor or the Social Security Administration or the Internal Revenue Service, having clarity of protecting it from being used for criminal purposes raises an important question, because if you do that because you want full participation and you want it used, then you have the issue, well, what if you discover fraud? What if you find out that something is going on that's an end run to the system? How do you handle that if you've created a firewall between this data and immigration enforcement? So some thinking needs to be done. I do think that if that's created, you may want to have exceptions. Under what circumstances could information be, and what types of information may be shared? But you need to be pretty stringent about it, or its utility will be limited if people think it's going to be abused.
Yeah. Nana and Dan, let's follow up on that. I mean, what are sort of the safeguards against using the information of foreigners for enforcement purposes in Japan and Canada? Nana, I'm not sure if you want to go first on that, or.
Actually, I'm not aware that the sort of similar type of longitudinal surveys have been done on migrants in general in Japan. I know that the longitudinal surveys have been conducted on highly skilled migrants under the points-based system. But for all other migrants, I don't think there is a survey like that, like in the US or Canada. I'm not aware of that.
Okay. And looking at the IMDb, what are sort of the safeguards against using that for enforcement purposes?
Yeah, I'm so glad, Ruth, that you raised this issue, because it's something that needs to be said. I mean, there's such a big contextual difference between talking about immigration in Canada and the United States. In Canada, we have, of course, like every country pretty much, we have a population of people who are unauthorized through our immigration system. So, take your pick, undocumented, illegal, unauthorized, whatever word you want to use. But it's considered really quite small. Official estimates by the Canadian government put that population at somewhere in the 100,000 to 200,000 persons range. And it's just not on the public imagination when people in Canada discuss issues of immigration. And it's just so much larger an issue in the United States. So I think we need to kind of know that context before I make my next point, which is, the IMDb is basically about authorized immigration and only authorized immigration. So there's you only get a record in the IMDb when you have a landing form, and you only fill out a landing form if you're an authorized immigrant. So the database covers the vast majority of immigrants to Canada, but in the United States, that wouldn't be the vast majority because you have such a large unauthorized population. So obviously, the way that Canada has done this couldn't be in any easy, simplistic way just adopted by the United States.
Yeah.
May I ask you?
Go for it.
Of Dan, if you don't mind, because could Canada do you have an employment verification system for workers? I'm embarrassed about my ignorance, but do employers, are they in trouble if they hire someone that's not authorized? And does the data that you work with allow them to make sure that they're only hiring people authorized to work in Canada?
Yeah, am I remembering this correctly? Is it I-9 or something like that? I've forgotten the terminology of the U.S. thing where employers have to send a notification to your system to
E-Verify.
Sorry, which one?
E-Verify, Ruth, right?
E-Verify. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I got the title of it completely wrong. E-Verify. Yeah. No, we don't have the same system. And again, it relates to the fact that in Canada we just don't have this national sense of urgency around this issue. Now, employers do have to ask for a person's social insurance number when they hire somebody. But they don't have to, seek that kind of permission in the same way that American employers are required to do. There's always the capacity for there to be, if you want to put it in these terms, a kind of an informal labor market in Canada, where employers hire somebody and don't bother to check the social security number, and therefore don't bother to inform, to fill in the proper forms for that person. But again, it's not seen as a big issue, so it's rarely comes up in public discourse around these questions.
So we've got a couple questions on a variation of a theme about what U.S. policymakers should consider when transitioning to a points-based system. Obviously, our report kind of looks into this a lot, but Nana and Dan, sort of based on the experiences from Canada and Japan and the implementation of their own respective versions of points-based systems, what are sort of a high-level takeaway that the U.S. should consider if it's going to take this step and implement one in the United States? Nana, you want to go first?
Okay, yeah.
No. Okay. Okay. Let me just think. I guess the verification of the job is perhaps the most challenging part, because I know that some reports have been discussing the cases where the workers who came under this points-based system, who were supposed to be very highly qualified, were actually working in the factories and stuff, not doing this thing that they were supposed to be doing. So monitoring is extremely difficult, and then sort of verification is probably the challenge, and that's one thing. And I guess because I live in Australia, perhaps I should mention something about Australian point system too. The Australian point system have been shifted to having more temporary nature, meaning that even if I guess if you get high points, then it should be okay. But then there are two parts to it, and then even if you got high points, like 75 points, let's say, but then and they're waiting for a while, and if somebody else comes in and if they scored higher points and if they got better jobs and stuff, and they get selected, and you're out, right? That's how things work in the skill select system. So in a sense that a lot of migrants will be in limbo, waiting, not knowing what's going to happen to the applications, even though they have to keep applying, because once it's only valid for 2 years. So it's harder for migrants to get accepted. But then I guess from the government's point of view, that's probably much faster and much more efficient in terms of administrative systems. So it's not, the Australian system is really probably good for the US government, but not for prospective immigrants.
Dan, your takeaway, one key piece
Sure.
of advice for transitioning.
Oh, I'm going to bother you by giving you more than one, but I'll start with just, Americans probably know this, but it's useful for them maybe to hear it from somebody from outside the United States. If the U.S. moves in this direction, the level of interest globally is going to be gigantic. Anyone who's interested in these sorts of questions should look from time to time at these surveys that the Gallup organization does worldwide, to look at how many people in the world want to migrate and where they want to migrate to. And guess what? The number one country that people want to go to is the United States. So if the U.S. changes and opens up its immigration system to a more widespread application-based, skills-based kind of system, you're going to get enormous interest. So that, first thing is design your system to deal with the fact that there's going to be just mega numbers of people who are eager to come to your country. That's my first point. Second point is, I'll just echo what Nana said around issues of integrity. Very, very important. Right from the outset, you've got to have systems of integrity built in, or you will start finding that people are using false documentation, et cetera, et cetera. It will besmirch the reputation of the institution that engages in it. That's all very basic, but super important. Third thing is to think through, what is going to be more beneficial for the U.S. Economy. Is it to respond to employers' stated needs, or is it to respond to bringing in the best and the brightest? And guess what? Employers don't always want the best and the brightest, right? Employers want dishwashers, they want truck drivers, they want all kinds of things. The things we didn't used to call essential services that now we've learned during this COVID moment, that economies can't function unless people drive trucks around. They can't function unless people clean up hospital rooms, et cetera, et cetera. Employers are desperate to get people who are high functioning, really motivated to do those jobs well. And moving into a points immigration system isn't necessarily going to supply that set of people. So you have to think through, what is it that employers want and the economy needs versus what is it that we can bring in to help propel innovation, future growth of the U.S. economy. And that leads to very important questions about how one designs the selection grid, the extent to which you privilege employers' desires and voices in that selection grid versus the prioritizing of people who kind of rise to the top of university systems, of education, of professional skill sets, and so forth. And then lastly, it's useful to just reflect for a minute on what happened in Canada. We didn't get the idea of matching supply and demand correctly. And that's why we had to go through that big moment of change in 2015, because we generated too many applications. We had a backlog of 1 million people. And Canada is only a country of 38 million people. We got 1 million people lined up in the system. So that comes back to my first point. But the idea of finding a way to a creative way to ensure that backlogs don't develop, and you get to pick the ones who'll be the most beneficial for your country. Those are kind of basic recommendations to think about.
Yeah. Ruth, any thoughts on what Nana and Dan said?
Well, I think they're excellent points, very excellent points, and illustrate the challenge that lies ahead in setting up. I like the idea of it as a grid, where you think of it as so it's not linear. It's a grid with different places and spots to be filled and checks. And this also speaks to one of the things that came out in the report, at least I gleaned from it, is the need to be facile. So employers might need something right now, but if we're looking at our own labor force needs, which is another set of data that's extremely important to guide this, what's being studied at the universities, and how many of these fields are already made up of international students anyway, and do we have, and being much more fine-tuned, as well as thinking about what we now know, and Dan just pointed out, essential workers. Whether and addressing those concerns to have a better balance, because in 1990 we changed our laws and almost totally cut out unskilled or low-skilled shortage workers, which prior to that had made up half of the employment-based flow. And because the thought was, well, we don't need unskilled. And if anything that we've learned is we may not think we need them, that they're in our national interest when we set these national objectives, but when we look at the particular needs and who's filling those jobs, we see that many, let's just say immigrants of an uncertain status, are doing a lot of the essential work right now. And so having a system that recognizes that and is facile enough to adjust and to anticipate, and also to pull back to pull back if we've misjudged a need we might have, and to build on that. That's key, and that's clearly key from the report and what Nana and Dan have said about the systems that they study, is that flexibility and adaptability of our future system is essential at this point in time.
Yeah. Well, I think Dan, go for it.
Yeah, could I just add 2 more points? I love this discussion. I think it's so important. I would just add, first point, systems have a much easier time of measuring and determining what we could call hard skills compared to soft skills. And yet employers are very, very concerned with soft skills. So that's another kind of thing. And then my other point I'd like to add to this is a point about complexity. So the more complicated you make an application system, the more you can get to what you really want, right? So you can really define your needs, and you can ask people a whole bunch of questions, and you can really nail everything down and have a great system. However, the more complicated you make your application process, the more scope you give for an industry to develop that will serve people who are wanting to make applications to your system. So the more complicated you make your system, the more you're creating the capacity for entrepreneurship and a whole new industry in supporting those applications. And you probably already can guess this, but a lot of the people in that industry are quite unscrupulous. And you can end up with people being hurt to pretty significant amounts. So be careful about this balance between, being really directive and really complicated in the way you design the system, and the way and what will happen to the ability for people to apply. And last comment, Canada got that wrong. We have way too complicated an application system. And that's also part of what we're trying to do better in the future.
Yeah. It's interesting because whenever the 2 reports I've written this year on comparative immigration systems, I can kind of guess the level of demand and complexity of the system based on how many websites are advertised for attorneys and services. In Australia, Canada, the United States has a lot of those. I have amazing immigration lawyer friends. You guys do great work, but unfortunately, not everybody gets access to the right professionals. But anyways, the last question is about backlogs. Dan, you were talking about sometimes Canada just didn't get it right, and we talked about this in passing. But how did Canada deal with its backlogs? We actually talked about this in the report. Can you dive into that? And then Nana, when the question is, has Japan or Australia, how do they deal with backlogs as well? So Dan, you go.
Yeah. So why does a backlog happen? It's useful to know that in the first place, right? So a backlog happens when you set your system and your thresholds at a level that's significantly below the number of people who actually want to come and the characteristics of those people. So let's say you have a system with 100 points, and you set your passing grade at 70 points, but there's millions of people around the world who would get 75 points, and they really want to come to your country. Then you're going to get a backlog, and that's exactly what happened with Canada. In fact, with those very numbers, that's exactly what happened with Canada. We had set the expectations of the system below the supply of people who wanted to apply to that system. So that meant that every year we had more applications than could be processed, and then gradually, the backlog took shape. I can't resist taking 30 seconds to tell you a tiny story. I visited the Canadian Embassy in Beijing during this backlog period. It was in the late 2010s. The folks in Beijing took me on a little tour, and one of the things they showed me was this gigantic room with compressed storage shelves. It went on for, I don't know, it was probably 100 feet long, this room, and 40, 50 feet wide with compressed storage. And those were all the unprocessed applications just from that one embassy, to give people a sense. And the US is a bigger attractor than Canada, so expect even bigger numbers. By the way, of course, that tells us about the days before these things were all done online. Okay, so how do you deal with the backlog? There's a bad way of dealing with it and a good way of dealing with it. Bad way of dealing with it is just tell everyone, hey, we just canceled your application. We have too many applications. Sure, you've paid a couple of $100. Maybe we'll give that back to you. Maybe we won't. Sure, you've put your life on hold. Sure, you've done all of this. And we'll just cancel our applications because it's administratively convenient for us not to have a backlog. And guess what? Canada's tried that. And guess what? It led to litigation and all kinds of very angry people and so forth. I think it did damage to the reputation of Canada as an immigrant open country and so forth. A much better way of dealing with a backlog is to design a system in the first place that prevents a backlog from happening. And that was the big shift we did in 2015, borrowing from ideas that had been put forward by New Zealand and Australia. I don't know, I don't want to take too much of your time. I'm happy to explain how the express entry system works, but it's in the report so people can get that information. But designing a system that prevents it from happening is way better than trying to solve it after the fact.
Nana?
Yes. In terms of point system in Japan, I don't think the backlog is very long. I don't think we have a huge backlog, partly because we accept very small, relatively speaking, compared with the Canada or the US. US doesn't have a point system, but compared to Canada, yes, the number is still very small. And also there has been a very big pressure on the administrators that the visas have to be issued very quickly. So most skilled migrants get notified after, within a month or so, and it's quite fast. So it's a very fast track process. And once you pass, and I think you can get a visa in a few months, it's quite fast, much faster than before. So the backlog issue is really, I don't think it's there in the case of Japan. And in the case of Australia, our backlog used to be huge in the past, but has been solved by this skill select system, which I mentioned earlier, that it's only valid for 2 years, and after 2 years, it's going to be gone. So if you don't get selected, then you'll just simply have to reapply. So the government doesn't have to worry about the backlog issue. So I think the system has been working quite well so far.
Yeah, Ruth, we'll just wrap it up with you. This past year we saw a pretty nasty battle over the Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act that sought to address some of the backlog in the employment-based system. So the last two questions for you is, there's the institutional ways that we deal with the backlog. So how do we deal with that? But how do we deal with the political issues around the backlog? And the individuals have already been invested in this, because we have individuals here, not sometimes in the United States, sometimes out of the United States, that are waiting decades to get their green card. How does the United States address those two challenges?
Well, it's not a good record, but it's sometimes we just have, when the backlogs weren't so great, we would sometimes pass laws and just clear the backlogs. It's a huge backlog at this point. The last time I checked, it was 4.1 million people who had approved pending petitions. So they were already qualified. They'd already been processed. They were just waiting in the queue. It's not a processing backlog. Nobody's being lazy. It's approved pending petitions of eligible people to come in, because we numerically limit the preference categories. And it does pose real issues in employment-based when you have people that are already here working on a temporary visa, and that visa is time limited and it's expiring, and there's no clear date that they're going to be able to qualify. They're qualified for a legal permanent resident visa. They're just behind in the queue. And getting something enacted, as you just mentioned, to deal with that has been a very heavy lift, because it gets caught in our broader numerically limited system, and the fact that we have per country caps, And our per country ceilings was the United States' response to the old quota, the old race-based immigration. And we had a hard time coming up with an alternative to quotas. It was the country caps, and nobody has come up with anything better yet to deal with equities and fairness and diversities. That would be a challenge in a point system if we start to have a queue of very qualified people, which I think we would have very quickly. A lot of very qualified individuals. So then within that pool, we have a pattern. Our history is first come, first serve. And then we queue people by country and categories. And that has created quite a scramble and a maze that keeps Chris's lawyer buddies in business and my buddies too. Because people are they going to get in? And some people would say, "I'll wait. It's worth it." If we could somehow get insights to design a system that didn't immediately start with a queue, but it's hard to do that in an environment that does set limits. And that is the other discussion, not for today, but for sometime soon, about what is an optimal level of annual admission. And that is also part of the messaging and the mission that was the very first question Chris asked. Is do we, and how much of doing the new system is linked to setting these overall goals and who has that authority? And those will be key issues of debate.
Yeah. No, I think that's the perfect place to leave this. Like I said, we could talk about this all day, and I talked about it with you quite a bit. So, so first and foremost, I want to thank the panelists. Thank you so much for participating in this. Calling in from where you are. I also want to thank all the experts we interviewed for the report. The expertise you provided for the report was essential for making it the product that it is. And I have to remind everybody to thank Angelina Downs, who was our intern this spring and this summer, who helped me co-write this report. I couldn't have done this without her. Dan and Nana, got to know her, as well. And she was essential to helping get this across the finish line. So thank you so much, Angelina. And with that, Teresa.
Sorry about that. We couldn't end a podcast. We couldn't end without somebody being on mute. But I want to thank you for joining us. Thank you, Chris. Thank you to our panelists. A reminder to all the audience, you can find this new report on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration, as well as all of our other work. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on Facebook and enable notifications so you get notified of all the BPC future events. You can also subscribe to our newsletters on our website to get more about the work that we're doing at BPC. We also have several podcasts, including This Week in Immigration, where we tackle the biggest public policy issues from a bipartisan perspective. You can find and subscribe to these podcasts on all major podcast platforms. Just search for Bipartisan Policy Center. Thanks again for joining us, and we will see you next time.